was a quote that says, before you can ask what to do, you need to answer, how'd I get there? And I like it for so many reasons, and I think it can apply to our lives in so many ways. And I thought of a really good example for how it applies, at least in horses, to where maybe you can see that there could be more to something than you realize. I had started doing this task with people who are early in my program to kind of help them understand where their relationship with their horse is right now. It helps people realize where there is a communication gap, and it helps people recognize where there's a trust gap and a belief in them gap. And it's not meant to make people feel bad about their relationships with their horses, but it's meant to help people recognize how much farther they can go in their relationship to improve it. So what it is it's two poles laying on the ground, simply just two poles laying on the ground, spread apart far enough that the horse can get between them, kind of like parallel bars. The idea is to ask your horse from nowhere in front of those poles to turn his tail towards the opening of those two poles and back through those poles. Sounds simple, but it's not. Now, depending on the personality of the person, I may decide to warn them in advance that the horse is going to avoid those poles with everything they've got. When you ask them to go to the left to try to turn their tail towards the poles, they're going to swing so far left that they're going to overshoot them, and then they'll be willing to back up on the other side. If you ask them to go to the right, they'll swing so far to the right, they'll overshoot the poles, and they'll be willing to back up on the other side, but they're not willing to stop with their tail squared up in front of that opening between the two poles. Now, here's the reason why. The reason why they're not willing to do that is because they don't believe you. They see the poles because their peripheral vision is how they survive, and they know they're there, but they don't believe you know they're there. They don't have enough belief in you to be aware of those poles. They don't have enough trust in you to be willing to back into those poles at your request. And your communication shows its gap through your inability to explain to them that you do know those poles are there and you do have a plan. The reason sometimes I say things to some people and not to others, there's others that I'll throw to the wolves and say, go ahead and try it. Because I think it's important for their resume that they recognize that there might be more to learn. Other people who I know have self-doubt and confidence issues already, I wouldn't throw them to the wolves in that case, because I know for a fact what your horse is going to do, and I know it's going to make you feel like you cannot do it. It's going to make you feel like you are unable to make this happen, which seems so simple. So I'll tell somebody who may struggle with self-doubt, I'll tell somebody who may struggle with self-confidence that don't you worry. This is what's going to happen. Your horse is going to avoid those poles as far as going between them, like his life depends on it. And now it's going to be your job to be responsible for his feet and to promise him that you are aware of those things and you're not going to get him into trouble. It's your job as his partner to promise him you're not going to get him into trouble. And when your horse won't do things for you that they suspect you aren't trustworthy enough and they don't believe in you enough, that's why they avoid things like that, because they don't believe you're not going to get them into trouble. Now, what's really, really, really interesting about this particular task is as soon as you can convince your horse that you do know those poles are there and that you do have a plan, and you do hope that they pay attention to you enough so you can help them understand the plan, your horse will get his back feet into those 2 poles. And after he is committed to having his back feet in there, as long as your timing is correct and you start to ask your horse to back up in that timing, your horse will gladly back through the rest of those poles like he never considered doubting you. But the entrance into those 2 poles will be your challenge. And that is where you're going to see how your relationship can improve. The whole point of the quote of being, before you ask, what do I do? You ask, how do I get there? How did you get there? Well, he didn't believe me, so he tried to protect himself. How did I get there? Well, my communication wasn't strong enough to explain to him that I do know those poles are there, and I've got his back. I'm not going to let him get into trouble. So before you start thinking about, well, how do I get him positioned back there? You have to figure out, how do I help him believe in me first? That's how you got where you are. You didn't get where you are because your horse doesn't like you. You got where you are because your horse doesn't trust you. You got where you are because you weren't clear about what you wanted him to understand. Then, once you know how to help your horse understand, once you know how to convince your horse that you do know those poles are there, once you've been able to make that communication and that trust built, then you can get to where you want to go. So it's kind of interesting, because then knowing what you need to do will be helpful. Because then you know you need to ask your horse to take a step and then back up. You need to ask your horse to be responsive to the shorter, smaller attempts, and before you know it, your horse is going to say, oh my gosh, I believe in you, you didn't get me into trouble, I didn't trip on that pole, you actually knew that was there, and this is what you want us to do? Before you know it, your horse will blindly do things for you. I mean, if you think about horses that do eventing, even up to the highest level of the Rolex, when that rider points that horse at this 5-tiered water jump, they're not going to want that horse to ask them, are you sure? They're going to want that horse to believe in them 100% that I pointed you at it, I'm sure. Let's do it. And the horse turn around and say, yeah, let's do it. That's a relationship that you need to strive for. That's the relationship that you're going to use these poles to indicate to yourself where you need to go from there.